Fight Club moments. If you shut up truth and bury it under the ground, it will but grow and gather to itself such explosive power that the day it bursts through, it will blow up everything in its way. Emile Zola. There is hardly the space to list all the successful people who have hit rock bottom. The notion everyone experiences jarring, perspective-altering moments is almost a cliché. That doesn't mean it isn't true. J.K. Rowling finds herself 7 years after college with a failed marriage, no job, single parent, kids she can barely feed, and approaching homelessness. A teenage Charlie Parker thinks he's tearing it up on stage, right in the pocket with the rest of the crew, until Joe Jones throws a cymbal at him and chases him away in humiliation. A young Lyndon Johnson is beaten to a pulp by a hill country farm boy over a girl, finally shattering his picture of himself as cock of the walk. There are many ways to hit bottom. Almost everyone does it in their own way at some point. In the novel Fight Club, the character Jack's apartment is blown up. All of his possessions, every stick of furniture, which he pathetically loved, were lost. Later, it turns out that Jack blew it up himself. He had multiple personalities, and Tyler Durden orchestrated the explosion to shock Jack from the sad stupor he was afraid to do anything about. The result was a journey into an entirely different and rather dark part of his life. In Greek mythology, characters often experience katabasis, or a going down. They're forced to retreat, they experience a depression, or in some cases literally descend into the underworld. When they emerge, it's with heightened knowledge and understanding. Today, we'd call that hell, and on occasion, we all spend some time there. We surround ourselves with bullshit, with distractions, with lies about what makes us happy and what's important. We become people we shouldn't become and engage in destructive, awful behaviors. This unhealthy and ego-derived state hardens and becomes almost permanent, until katabasis forces us to face it. Duris dura fragantur. Hard things are broken by hard things. The bigger the ego, the harder the fall. It would be nice if it didn't have to be this way. If we could nicely be nudged to correct our ways. If a quiet admonishment was what it took to shoo away illusions. If we could manage to circumvent ego on our own. But it is just not so. The Reverend William A. Sutton observed some 120 years ago that we cannot be humble except by enduring humiliations. How much better it would be to spare ourselves these experiences, but sometimes it's the only way the blind can be made to see. In fact, many significant life changes come from moments in which we are thoroughly demolished, in which everything we thought we knew about the world is rendered false. We might call these Fight Club moments. Sometimes they are self-inflicted, sometimes inflicted on us, but whatever the cause, they can be catalysts for changes we were petrified to make. Pick a time in your life, or perhaps it's a moment you're experiencing now. A boss's eviscerating critique of you in front of the entire staff, that sit down with the person you loved, the Google alert that delivered the article you'd hoped would never be written, the call from the creditor, the news that threw you back in your chair, speechless and dumbfounded. It was in those moments, when the break exposes something unseen before, that you were forced to make eye contact with a thing called truth. No longer could you hide or pretend. Such a moment raises many questions. How do I make sense of this? How do I move onward and upward? Is this the bottom, or is there more to come? Someone told me my problems, so how do I fix them? How did I let this happen? How can it never happen again? A look at history finds that these events seem to be defined by three traits. 1, they almost always came at the hands of some outside force or person. 2, they often involved things we already knew about ourselves but were too scared to admit. 3, from the ruin came the opportunity for great progress and improvement. Does everyone take advantage of that opportunity? Of course not. Ego often causes the crash and then blocks us from improving. Was the 2008 financial crisis not a moment in which everything was laid bare for many people? The lack of accountability, the over-leveraged lifestyles, the greed, the dishonesty, the trends that could not possibly continue. For some, this was a wake-up call. Others, just a few years later, are back exactly where they were. For them, it will be worse the next time. Hemingway had his own rock-bottom realizations as a young man. The understanding he took from them is expressed timelessly in his book, A Farewell to Arms. He wrote, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward many are strong at the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills." The world can show you the truth, but no one can force you to accept it. In 12-step groups, almost all the steps are about suppressing the ego and clearing out the entitlements and baggage and wreckage that has been accumulated, so that you might see what's left when all of that is stripped away and the real you is left. It's always so tempting to turn to that old friend, denial, which is your ego refusing to believe that which you don't like could be true. Psychologists often say that threatened egotism is one of the most dangerous forces on earth. The gang member whose honor is impugned, the narcissist who is rejected, the bully who is made to feel shame, the imposter who is exposed, the plagiarist or the embellisher whose story stops adding up. These are not people who you want to be near when they are cornered, nor is it a corner you want to back yourself into. That's where you think, how can these people talk to me this way? Who do they think they are? I'll make them all pay. Sometimes because we can't face what's been said or what's been done, we do the unthinkable in response to the unbearable. We escalate. This is ego in its purest and most toxic form. Look at Lance Armstrong. He cheated, but so did a lot of people. It was when this cheating was made public and he was forced to see, if only for a second, that he was a cheater, that things got really bad. He insisted on denying it despite all the evidence. He insisted on ruining other people's lives. We're so afraid to lose our own esteem, or God forbid the esteem of others, that we contemplate doing terrible things. As the Bible verse goes, everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. Big and small, this is what we do. Getting hit with that spotlight doesn't feel good, whether we're talking about the exposure of ordinary self-deception or true evil. But turning away only delays the reckoning. For how long? No one can say. Face the symptoms, cure the disease. Ego makes it so hard. It's easier to delay, to double down, to deliberately avoid seeing the changes we need to make in our lives. But change begins by hearing the criticism and the words of the people around you. Even if those words are mean-spirited, angry, or hurtful, it means weighing them, discarding the ones that don't matter, and reflecting on the ones that do. In Fight Club, the character has to firebomb his own apartment to finally break through. Our expectations and exaggerations and lack of restraint made such moments inevitable, ensuring that it would be painful. Now it's here. What will you make of it? You can change, or you can deny. Vince Lombardi said this once, "A team, like men, must be brought to its knees before it can rise again." So yes, hitting bottom is as brutal as it sounds. But the feeling after is one of the most powerful perspectives in the world. President Obama described it as he neared the end of his tumultuous, trying terms. "I've been in the barrel tumbling down Niagara Falls, and I emerged, and I lived, and that's such a liberating feeling. If we could help it, it would be better if we never suffered illusions at all. It'd be better if we never had to kneel or go over the edge. That's what we've spent so much time talking about so far in this book. If that fight is lost, we end up here. In the end, the only way you can appreciate your progress is to stand on the edge of the hole you dug for yourself, look down inside it, and smile fondly at the bloody claw prints that marked your journey up the walls." Draw the line. It can ruin your life only if it ruins your character. Marcus Aurelius. John DeLorean ran his car company into the ground with a mix of outsized ambition, negligence, narcissism, greed, and mismanagement. As the bad news began to pile up and the picture was made clear and public, how do you think he responded? Was it with resigned acceptance? Did he acknowledge the errors his disgruntled employees were speaking out about for the first time? Was he able to reflect even slightly on the mistakes and decisions that had brought him, his investors, and his employees so much trouble? Of course not. Instead, he put into motion a series of events that would end in a $60 million drug deal and his subsequent arrest. That's right. After his company began to fail, failure almost exclusively tied to his unprofessional management style, he figured the best way to save it all would be to secure financing through an illegal shipment of 220 pounds of cocaine. Sure, after his publicized and very embarrassing arrest, DeLorean was eventually acquitted on the charges on the rather implausible argument of entrapment. Except he is on video holding up a baggie of cocaine, saying with giddy excitement, "This stuff is as good as gold." There's no question about who caused John DeLorean's disintegration. There's also no question about who made it so much worse. The answer is him. He found himself in a hole and kept digging until he made it all the way to hell. If only he'd stopped. If at any point he'd said, "Is this the person I want to be?" People make mistakes all the time. They start companies they think they can manage. They have grand and bold visions that were a little too grandiose. This is all perfectly fine. It's what being an entrepreneur or a creative or even a business executive is all about. We take risks, we mess up. The problem is when we get our identity tied up in our work, we worry that any kind of failure will then say something bad about us as a person. It's a fear of taking responsibility, of admitting that we might have messed up. It's the sunk cost fallacy. And so we throw good money and good life after bad and end up making everything so much worse. Let's say the walls feel like they're closing in. It might feel as if you've been betrayed or your life's work is being stolen. But these are not rational good emotions that will lead to rational good actions. Ego asks, why is this happening to me? How do I save this and prove to everyone I'm as great as they think? It's the animal fear of even the slightest sign of weakness. You've seen this, you've done this, fighting desperately for something we're only making worse. It is not a path to great things. Take Steve Jobs. He was 100% responsible for his firing from Apple. Due to his later success, Apple's decision to fire him seems like an example of poor leadership, but he was, at the time, unmanageable. His ego was unequivocally out of control. If you were John Sculley and the CEO of Apple, you'd have fired that version of Steve Jobs too, and been right to do so. Now, Steve Jobs' response to his firing was understandable. He cried, he fought. When he lost, he sold all but a single share of his stock in Apple and swore never to think of the place again. But then he started a new company and threw his whole life into it. He tried to learn as best he could from the management mistakes at the root of his first failure. He started another company after that too, called Pixar. Steve Jobs, the famous egomaniac who parked in handicapped parking spaces just because he could, responded in this critical moment in a surprisingly humble way. Humble for CEOs convinced of their own genius anyway. He worked until he'd not only proven himself again, but significantly resolved the flaws that had caused his downfall to begin with. It's not often that successful or powerful people are able to do this, not when they experience heart-rending failure. American Apparel's founder, Joe Charney, is an example. After losses of some $300 million and numerous scandals, the company offered him a choice: step aside as CEO and guide the company as a creative consultant for a large salary, or be fired. He rejected both options and picked something much worse. After filing a lawsuit in protest, he gambled his entire ownership in the company to initiate a hostile takeover with a hedge fund and insisted that his conduct be investigated and judged. It was, and he was not vindicated. His personal life was splashed across the headlines and embarrassing details revealed. The lawyer he chose to represent him in his lawsuits happened to be the same one who'd already sued Charney close to half a dozen times for sexual harassment and financial irregularities. In the past, Charney had accused this man of shaking him down and making bogus legal claims. Now, they were working together. American Apparel spent more than $10 million it didn't have to fight him off. A judge issued a restraining order. Sales slumped. Finally, the company began laying off factory workers and longtime employees, the exact people he claimed to be fighting for, just to stay afloat. A year later, they were bankrupt, and he was out of money too. I was there. I saw all of it. It broke my heart. It's like the disgraced statesman and General Alcibiades. In the Peloponnesian War, he fought first for his home country and greatest love, Athens. Then, driven out for a drunken crime he may or may not have committed, he defected to Sparta, Athens' sworn enemy. Then, running afoul of the Spartans, he defected to Persia, the sworn enemy of both. Finally, he was recalled to Athens, where his ambitious plans to invade Sicily drove the Athenians to their ultimate ruin. Ego kills what we love. Sometimes it comes close to killing us, too. It is interesting that Alexander Hamilton, who of all the founding fathers met the most tragic and unnecessary end, would have wise words on this topic. But indeed he does. If only he could have remembered his own advice before fighting his fatal duel. Act with fortitude and honor, he wrote to a distraught friend in serious financial and legal trouble of the man's own making. If you cannot reasonably hope for a favorable extrication, do not plunge deeper. Have the courage to make a full stop. A full stop. It's not that these folks should have quit everything. It's that a fighter who can't tap out or a boxer who can't recognize when it's time to retire gets hurt. Seriously so. You have to be able to see the bigger picture. But when ego is in control, who can? Let's say you failed, and let's even say it was your fault. Shit happens, and as they say, sometimes shit happens in public. It's not fun. The questions remain. Are you going to make it worse? Are you going to emerge from this with your dignity and character intact? Are you going to live to fight another day? When a team looks like they're going to lose a game, the coach doesn't call them all over and lie to them. Instead, he or she reminds them who they are and what they're capable of, and urges them to go back out there and embody that. With winning or miracles off their mind, a good team does its best to complete the game at the highest standard possible, and share the playing time with other players who don't regularly play. And sometimes, they even come back and win. Most trouble is temporary, unless you make that not so. Recovery is not grand, it's one step in front of the other, unless your cure is more of the disease. Only ego thinks embarrassment or failure are more than what they are. History is full of people who suffered abject humiliations, yet recovered to have long and impressive careers. Politicians who lost elections or lost offices due to indiscretions, but came back to lead after time had passed. Actors whose movies bombed, authors who got writer's block, celebrities who made gaffes, parents who made mistakes, entrepreneurs with faltering companies, executives who got fired, athletes who were cut, people who lived too well at the top of the market. All of these folks felt the hard edge of failure, just like we have. When we lose, we have a choice. Are we going to make this a lose-lose situation for ourselves and everyone involved? Or will this be a lose and then win? Because you will lose in life. It's a fact. A doctor has to call time of death at some point. They just do. Ego says we're the immovable object, the unstoppable force. This delusion causes the problems. It meets failure and adversity with rule breaking, betting everything on some crazy scheme, doubling down on behind-the-scenes machinations or unlikely Hail Marys, even though that's what got you to this pain point in the first place. At any given time in the circle of life, we may be aspiring, succeeding, or failing, though right now, we're failing. With wisdom, we understand that these positions are transitory, not statements about your value as a human being. When success begins to slip from your fingers, for whatever reason, the response isn't to grip and claw so hard that you shatter it to pieces. It's to understand that you must work yourself back to the aspirational phase. You must get back to first principles and best practices. He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a living man, Seneca once said. Alter that. He who will do anything to avoid failure will almost certainly do something worthy of failure. The only real failure is abandoning your principles. Killing what you love because you can't bear to part from it is selfish and stupid. If your reputation can't absorb a few blows, it wasn't worth anything in the first place. Maintain your own scorecard. I never look back except to find out about mistakes. I only see danger in thinking back about things you are proud of. Elizabeth Noel Neumann. On April 16, 2000, the New England Patriots drafted an extra quarterback out of the University of Michigan. They'd scouted him thoroughly and had their eye on him for some time. Seeing that he was still available, they took him. It was the 6th round and the 199th pick of the draft. The young quarterback's name was Tom Brady. He was 4th string at the beginning of his rookie season. By his second season, he was a starter. New England won the Super Bowl that year. Brady was named MVP. In terms of return on investment, it's probably the single greatest draft pick in the history of football. 4 Super Bowl rings out of 6 appearances, 14 starting seasons, 172 wins, 428 touchdowns, 3 Super Bowl MVPs, 58,000 yards, 10 Pro Bowls, and more division titles than any quarterback in history. It's not even finished paying dividends. Brady may still have many more seasons left in him. So you'd think that the Patriots front office would be ecstatic with how it turned out. And indeed they were. They were also disappointed, deeply so, in themselves. Brady's surprising abilities meant that the Patriots' scouting reports were way off. For all their evaluations of players, they'd somehow missed or miscalculated all of his intangible attributes. They'd let this gem wait until the 6th round. Someone else could have drafted him. More than that, they didn't even know they were right about Brady until injuries knocked out Drew Bledsoe, their prize starter, and forced them to realize his potential. So even though their bets paid off, the Patriots honed in on the specific intelligence failure that could have prevented the pick from happening in the first place. Not that they were nitpicking or indulging in perfectionism, they had higher standards of performance to adhere to. For years, Scott Pioli, director of personnel for the Patriots, kept a photo on his desk of Dave Stachelski, a player the team had drafted in the 5th round, but had never made it through training camp. It was a reminder. You're not as good as you think. You don't have it all figured out. Stay focused. Do better. Coach John Wooden was very clear about this too. The scoreboard was not the judge of whether he or the team had achieved success. That wasn't what constituted winning. Bo Jackson wouldn't get impressed when he hit a home run or ran for a touchdown because he knew he hadn't done it perfect. In fact, he didn't ask for the ball after his first hit in Major League Baseball for that reason. To him, it was just a ground ball up the middle. This is characteristic of how great people think. It's not that they find failure in every success. They just hold themselves to a standard that exceeds what society might consider to be objective success. Because of that, they don't much care what other people think. They care whether they meet their own standards. And these standards are much, much higher than everyone else's. The Patriots saw the Brady pick as being more lucky than smart. And though some people are fine giving themselves credit for luck, they weren't. No one would say that the Patriots or any team in the NFL are without ego. But in this instance, instead of celebrating or congratulating themselves, they put their heads back down and focused on how to get even better. That's what makes humility such a powerful force, organizationally, personally, professionally. This isn't necessarily fun, by the way. It can feel like self-inflicted torture sometimes, but it does force you to always keep going and always improve. Ego can't see both sides of the issue. It can't get better because it only sees the validation. Remember, vain men never hear anything but praise. It can only see what's going well, not what isn't. It's why you might see egomaniacs with temporary leads, but rarely lasting runs of it. For us, the scoreboard can't be the only scoreboard. Warren Buffett has said the same thing, making a distinction between the inner scorecard and the external one. Your potential, the absolute best you're capable of, that's the metric to measure yourself against. Your standards are. Winning is not enough. People can get lucky and win. People can be assholes and win. Anyone can win. But not everyone is the best possible version of themselves. Harsh? Yes. The flip side of that is it means honestly being able to be proud and strong during the occasional defeat as well. When you take ego out of the equation, other people's opinions and external markers don't matter as much. That's more difficult, but ultimately a formula for resilience. The economist and philosopher Adam Smith had a theory for how wise and good people evaluate their actions. He said, "There are two different occasions upon which we examine our own conduct and endeavor to view it in the light in which the impartial spectator would view it. First, when we are about to act, and secondly, after we have acted. Our views are apt to be very partial in both cases, but they are apt to be most partial when it is of the most importance that they should be otherwise. When we are about to act, the eagerness of passion will seldom allow us to consider what we are doing with the candor of an indifferent person. When the action is over, indeed, and the passions which prompted it have subsided, we can enter more coolly into the sentiments of the indifferent spectator. This indifferent spectator is a sort of guide with which we can judge our behavior, as opposed to the groundless applause that society so often gives out. Not that it's just about validation, though. Think of all the people who excuse their behavior, politicians, powerful CEOs, and the like, as not technically illegal. Think of the times you've excused your own with "no one will know." This is the moral gray area that our ego loves to exploit. Holding your ego against a standard, inner or indifferent or whatever you want to call it, makes it less and less likely that excess or wrongdoing is going to be tolerated by you. Because it's not about what you can get away with, it's about what you should or shouldn't do. It's a harder road at first, but one that ultimately makes us less selfish and self-absorbed. A person who judges himself based on his own standards doesn't crave the spotlight the same way as someone who lets applause dictate success. A person who can think long-term doesn't pity herself during short-term setbacks. A person who values the team can share credit and subsume his own interests in a way that most others can't. Reflecting on what went well or how amazing we are doesn't get us anywhere, except maybe to where we are right now. But we want to improve. We want more. We want to continue to improve. Ego blocks that, so we subsume it and smash it with continually higher standards. Not that we are endlessly pursuing more, as if we are racked with greed, but instead we're inching our way towards real improvement, with discipline rather than disposition. Always love. And why should we feel anger at the world, as if the world would notice? Euripides. In 1939, a young prodigy named Orson Welles was given one of the most unheard of deals in Hollywood history. He could write, act, and direct in 2 films of his choosing for RKO, a major movie studio. For his first picture, he decided to tell the story of a mysterious newspaper baron who became a prisoner of his enormous empire and lifestyle. William Randolph Hearst, the infamous media magnate, decided that this movie was based on his life, and more importantly, that it did so offensively. He then began and initially succeeded in an all-consuming campaign to destroy one of the greatest films of all time. Here's what's so interesting about this. First, Hearst most likely never even saw the film, so he had no idea what was actually in it. Second, it wasn't intended to be about him, or at least solely about him. As far as we know, the character Charles Foster Kane was an amalgam of several historical figures, including Samuel Insull and Robert McCormick. The movie was also inspired by 2 similar portraits of power by Charlie Chaplin and Aldous Huxley, and it wasn't supposed to vilify, but to humanize. Third, Hearst was one of the richest men in the world at the time, and at 78, near the end of his life. Why would he spend so much time on something as inconsequential as a fictional movie by a first-time director? Fourth, it was his campaign to stop it that secured the movie's place in popular lore and made it clear the extent to which his drive to control and manipulate would go. Ironically, he cemented his own legacy as a reviled American figure far more than any critic ever could have. Thus, the paradox of hate and bitterness. It accomplishes almost exactly the opposite of what we hope it does. In the internet age, we call this the Streisand effect, named after a similar attempt by the singer and actress Barbra Streisand, who tried to legally remove a photo of her home from the web. Her actions backfired, and far more people saw it than would have had she left the issue alone. Attempting to destroy something out of hate or ego often ensures that it will be preserved and disseminated forever. The lengths that Hearst went to were absurd. He sent his most influential and powerful gossip columnist, Luella Parsons, to the studio to demand a screening. Based on her feedback, he decided that he would do everything in his power to block it from being made public. He issued a directive that none of his newspapers were to make any mention of any RKO film, the company producing Citizen Kane, period. More than a decade later, this ban still applied to Welles for all Hearst papers. Hearst papers began exploring negative stories about Welles and his private life. His gossip columnists threatened to do the same to each of RKO's board members. Hearst also made threats to the movie industry as a whole as a way of turning other studio heads against the picture. An $800,000 offer was made for the rights to the film so that it might be burned or destroyed. Most theater chains were pressured into refusing to show it, and no ads for it were allowed in any Hearst-owned properties. Hearst sympathizers began reporting rumors about Welles to various authorities, and in 1941, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI opened a file on him. The result was that the movie failed commercially. It took years for it to find its place in the culture. Only at great expense and with great exertion was Hearst able to hold it back. We all have stuff that pisses us off. The more successful or powerful we are, the more there will be that we think we need to protect in terms of our legacy, image, and influence. If we're not careful, however, we can end up wasting an incredible amount of time trying to keep the world from displeasing or disrespecting us. It is a sobering thought to consider for a moment all the needless death and needless waste inflicted over the eons by angry men or aggrieved women on other people, on society, and on themselves. Over what? Reasons that can hardly be remembered. You know what is a better response to an attack or a slight or something you don't like? Love. That's right, love. For the neighbor who won't turn down the music, for the parent that let you down, For the bureaucrat who lost your paperwork, for the group that rejects you, for the critic who attacks you, the former partner who stole your business idea, the bitch or the bastard who cheated on you. Love. Because as the song lyrics go, hate will get you every time. Okay, maybe love is too much to ask for whatever it is that you've had done to you. You could, at the very least, try to let it go. You could try to shake your head and laugh about it. Otherwise, the world will witness another example of a timeless and sad pattern. Rich, powerful person becomes so isolated and delusional that when something happens contrary to his wishes, he becomes consumed by it. The same drive that made him great is suddenly a great weakness. He turns a minor inconvenience into a massive sore. The wound festers, becomes infected, and can even kill him. This is what propelled Nixon forward and then sadly downward. Reflecting on his own exile, he later acknowledged that his lifelong image of himself as a scrappy fighter battling a hostile world was his undoing. He'd surrounded himself with other such tough guys. People forget that Nixon was re-elected by a landslide after Watergate broke. He just couldn't help himself. He kept fighting, he persecuted reporters, and he lashed out at everyone he felt had slighted or doubted him. It's what continued to feed the story and ultimately sank him. Like many such people, he ended up doing more damage to himself than anyone else could. The root of it was his hatefulness and his anger, and even being the most powerful leader in the free world couldn't change it. It doesn't need to be like that. Booker T. Washington tells an anecdote told to him by Frederick Douglass about a time he was traveling and asked to move and ride in the baggage car because of his race. A white supporter rushed up to him to apologize for this horrible offense. "I'm sorry, Mr. Douglass, that you have been degraded in this manner," the person said. Douglass would have none of that. He wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt. He replied with great fervor, "They cannot degrade Frederick Douglass. The soul that is within me no man can degrade. I am not the one that is being degraded on account of this treatment, but those who are inflicting it upon me." Certainly, this is an incredibly difficult attitude to maintain. It's far easier to hate. It's natural to lash out. Yet we find what defines great leaders like Douglass is that instead of hating their enemies, they feel a sort of pity and empathy for them. Think of Barbara Jordan at the 1992 Democratic National Convention proposing an agenda of love, 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 love. Think of Martin Luther King Jr. over and over again preaching that hate was a burden and love was freedom. Love was transformational, hate was debilitating. In one of his most famous sermons, he took it further. He said, "We begin to love our enemies and love those persons that hate us, whether in collective life or individual life, by looking at ourselves." We must strip ourselves of the ego that protects and suffocates us, because, as he said, hate at any point is a cancer that gnaws away at the very vital center of your life and your existence. It is like eroding acid that eats away the best and the objective center of your life. Take inventory for a second. What do you dislike? Whose name fills you with revulsion and rage? Now ask, have these strong feelings really helped you accomplish anything? Take an even wider inventory. Where has hatred and rage ever really gotten anyone? Especially because almost universally, the traits or behaviors that have pissed us off in other people, their dishonesty, their selfishness, their laziness, are hardly going to work out well for them in the end. Their ego and short-sightedness contains its own punishment. The question we must ask ourselves is, are we going to be miserable just because other people are? Consider how Orson Welles responded to the multi-decade campaign by Hearst. According to his own account, he bumped into Hearst in an elevator on the night of the movie's premiere, the very one that Hearst had deployed massive resources to prevent and destroy. Do you know what he did? He invited Hearst to come. When Hearst declined, Welles joked that Charles Foster Kane surely would have accepted. It took a very long time for Wells's genius in that movie to finally be acknowledged by the rest of the world. No matter, Wells soldiered on, making other movies and producing other fantastic art. By all accounts, he lived a fulfilling and happy life. Eventually, Citizen Kane secured its place in the forefront of cinematic history. 70 years after the movie's debut, it was finally played at Hearst Castle at San Simeon, which is now a state park. The events he endured weren't exactly fair, but at least he didn't let it ruin his life. As Wells's girlfriend of 20-plus years said in his eulogy, referring not just to Hearst, but to every slight he ever received in his long career in a notoriously ruthless industry, "I promise you it didn't make him bitter. In other words, he never became like Hearst." Not everyone is capable of responding that way. At various points in our lives, we seem to have different capacities for forgiveness and understanding. And even when some people are able to carry on, they carry with them a needless load of resentment. Remember Kirk Hammett, who suddenly became the guitarist in Metallica? The man they kicked out to make room for him, Dave Mustaine, went on to form another band, Megadeth. Even amidst his own unbelievable success, he was eaten up with rage and hatred over the way he'd been treated those many years before. It drove him to addiction and could have killed him. It was 18 years until he was able to begin to process it, and said it still felt like yesterday that he'd been hurt and rejected. When you hear him tell it, as he did once on camera to his former bandmates, it sounds like he ended up living under a bridge. In reality, the man sold millions of records, produced great music, and lived the life of a rock star. We've all felt this pain, and to quote his lyrics, smiled its black-toothed grin. This obsession with the past, with something that someone did or how things should have been, as much as it hurts, is ego embodied. Everyone else has moved on, but you can't, because you can't see anything but your own way. You can't conceive of accepting that someone could hurt you, deliberately or otherwise. So you hate. In failure or adversity, it's so easy to hate. Hate defers blame. It makes someone else responsible. It's a distraction, too. We don't do much else when we're busy getting revenge or investigating the wrongs that have supposedly been done to us. Does this get us any closer to where we want to be? No. It just keeps us where we are, or worse, arrests our development entirely. If we are already successful, as Hearst was, it tarnishes our legacy and turns sour what should be our golden years. Meanwhile, love is right there. Egoless, open, positive, vulnerable, peaceful, and productive. For all that comes next, ego is the enemy. I don't like work. No man does. But I like what is in the work, the chance to find yourself. Joseph Conrad. In William Manchester's epic biography of the life of Winston Churchill, the middle volume, a third of the set, is titled Alone. For a full 8 years, Churchill stood more or less by himself against his short-sighted peers, against the rising threat of fascism, even among the West. But eventually he triumphed again, and faced adversity again, and was vindicated again. Katharine Graham stood alone as she took over her family's newspaper empire. Her son, Donald Graham, must have felt similar pressure as he sought to preserve the company during the dramatic declines of the industry in the mid-2000s. Both made it through. So can you. There is no way around it. We will experience difficulty. We will feel the touch of failure. As Benjamin Franklin observed, those who drink to the bottom of the cup must expect to meet with some of the dregs. But what if the dregs weren't so bad? As Harold Geenen put it, people learn from their failures. Seldom do they learn anything from success. It's why the old Celtic saying tells us, see much, study much, suffer much. That is the path to wisdom. What you face right now could, should, and can be such a path. Wisdom or ignorance, ego is the swing vote. Aspiration leads to success and adversity. Success creates its own adversity and, hopefully, new ambitions. And adversity leads to aspiration and more success. It's an endless loop. All of us exist on this continuum. We occupy different places on it at various points in our lives. But when we do fail, it sucks. No question. Whatever is next for us, we can be sure of one thing we'll want to avoid: ego. It makes all the steps hard, but failure is the one it will make permanent, unless we learn right here and right now from our mistakes. Unless we use this moment as an opportunity to understand ourselves and our own mind better, ego will seek out failure like true north. All great men and women went through difficulties to get to where they are. All of them made mistakes. They found within those experiences some benefit, even if it was simply the realization that they are not infallible and that things would not always go their way. They found that self-awareness was the way out and through. If they hadn't, they wouldn't have gotten better and they wouldn't have been able to rise again. Which is why we have their mantra to guide us, so that we can survive and thrive in every phase of our journey. It is simple, though, as always, never easy. Not to aspire or seek out of ego, to have success without ego, to push through failure with strength, not ego. Epilogue. There is something of a civil war going on within all of our lives. There is a recalcitrant south of our soul revolting against the north of our soul. And there is this continual struggle within the very structure of every individual life. Martin Luther King Jr. If you're listening to this right now, then you have made it through this book. I was afraid some people might not. To be perfectly honest, I wasn't sure I'd ever get here myself. How do you feel? Tired? Confused? Free? It's no easy task to go head-to-head with one's ego, to accept first that ego may be there, then to subject it to scrutiny and criticism. Most of us can't handle uncomfortable self-examination. It's easier to do just about anything else. In fact, some of the world's most unbelievable accomplishments are undoubtedly a result of a desire to avoid facing the darkness of ego. In any case, just by making it to this point, you've struck a serious blow against it. It's not all you need to do, but it is a start. My friend, the philosopher and martial artist Daniele Bolelli, once gave me a helpful metaphor. He explained that training was like sweeping the floor. Just because we've done it once doesn't mean the floor is clean forever. Every day the dust comes back. Every day we must sweep. The same is true for ego. You would be stunned at what kind of damage dust and dirt can do over time, and how quickly it accumulates and becomes utterly unmanageable. A few days after being fired by the American Apparel Board of Directors, Dov Charney called me at 3 a.m. He was alternately despondent and angry, genuinely believing himself to be totally blameless for his situation. I asked him, "What are you going to do? Are you going to pull a Steve Jobs and start a new company? Are you going to make a comeback?" He got quiet and said to me with an earnestness I could feel through the phone and in my bones, "Ryan, Steve Jobs died." To him, in this addled state, this failure, this blow was somehow the same as death. That was one of the last times we ever spoke. I watched with horror in the months that followed as he wreaked havoc on the company he had put everything into building. It was a sad moment and one that has stayed with me. But for the grace of God go I, but for the grace of God, that could be any of us. We all experience success and failure in our own way. Struggling to write this book, I went through 4 hard-fought but rejected drafts of the proposal and dozens of drafts of the manuscript. On my earlier projects, I'm sure the strain would have broken me. Maybe I would have quit or tried to work with someone else. Maybe I would have dug in my heels to get my way and irreparably damaged the book. At some point during the process, I came up with a therapeutic device. After each draft, I would tear up the pages and feed the paper to a worm compost I kept in my garage. A few months later, those painful pages were dirt that nourished my yard, which I could walk on with bare feet. It was a real and tangible connection to that larger immensity. I like to remind myself that the same process is going to happen to me when I'm done, when I die and nature tears me up. One of the most freeing realizations came to me while I was writing and thinking about the ideas in the pages you've just listened to. It occurred to me what a damaging delusion this notion that our lives are grand monuments set to last for all time really is. Any ambitious person knows that feeling, that you must do great things, that you must get your way, and that if you don't, that you're a worthless failure and the world is conspiring against you. There's so much pressure that eventually we all break under it or are broken by it. Of course, that is not true. Yes, we all have potential within us. We all have goals and accomplishments that we know we can achieve, whether it's starting a company, finishing a creative work, making a run at a championship, or getting to the top of your respective field. These are worthy aims. A broken person will not get there. The problem is when ego intrudes on these pursuits, corrupting them and undermining us as we set out to achieve and accomplish. Whispering lies as we embark on that journey, and whispering lies as we succeed in it, and worse, whispering painful lies when we stumble along the way. Ego, like any drug, might be indulged at first in the misguided attempt to get an edge or to take one off. The problem is how quickly it becomes an end unto itself, which is how one finds themselves in surreal moments like the one I experienced on the phone with Dove, or in any of the cautionary tales in this book. In the course of my work and my life, I've found that most of the consequences of ego are not quite so calamitous. Many of the people in your life and in our world who have given over to their ego will not get what they deserve in the sense of karmic justice that we're taught to believe in as kids. I wish it were so simple. Instead, the consequences are closer to the ending of one of my favorite books, What Makes Sammy Run, by Bud Schulberg, a novel whose famous character is based on the real lives of entertainment entrepreneurs like Samuel Goldwyn and David L. Selznick. In the book, the narrator is called to the palatial mansion of a calculating, ruthless, egotistical Hollywood mogul whose precipitous rise he has followed with a mix of admiration and confusion and eventually disgust. In this moment of vulnerability, the narrator catches a true glimpse into the man's life, his lonely, empty marriage, his fear, his insecurity, his inability to be still even for a second. He realizes that the vengeance, the bad karma he'd hoped for all the rules the man had broken, all the cheating ways he had gotten ahead, wasn't coming, because it was already there. As he writes, I had expected something conclusive and fatal, and now I realized that what was coming to him was not a sudden payoff, but a process. A disease that he had caught in the epidemic that swept over his birthplace like a plague. A cancer that was slowly eating him away, the symptoms developing and intensifying. Success, loneliness, fear. Fear of all the bright young men, the newer, fresher Sammy Glicks that would spring up to harass him, to threaten him, and finally overtake him. That's how ego manifests itself. And isn't that what we're desperately afraid of becoming? I'll reveal one last thing I hope will make this come full circle. I first read that passage when I was 19 years old. It was reading assigned by a seasoned mentor who had found, as I would, early success in the entertainment business. The book was influential and informative for me, just as he'd known it would be. Yet over the next few years, I worked myself into a nearly identical situation as the characters in the book. Not just summoned to the palatial home to watch the expected and unavoidable dissolution of a person I admired, but to find myself dangerously close to my own shortly thereafter. I know the passage struck me because when I went to type it up for this epilogue, I found in my original copy pages covered in my own handwriting, written years before, detailing my reaction right before I had set out into the world. Clearly, I had understood Schulberg's words intellectually, even emotionally, but I had made the wrong choices anyway. I had swept once and thought it was enough. 10 years after first reading it and writing down my thoughts, I was ready once more. Those lessons came home to me in exactly the way I needed them to. There's a quote from Bismarck that says, in effect, any fool can learn from experience. The trick is to learn from other people's experience. This book started around the latter idea, and to my surprise, ended with a painful amount of the former as well. I set out to study ego and came crashing into my own, and to those of the people I had long since looked up to. It may be that you'll need to experience some of that on your own too. Perhaps it is like Plutarch's reflection that we don't so much gain the knowledge of things by the words, as words by the experience we have of things. In any case, I want to conclude this book with the idea that has underpinned all of what you've just heard. That it's admirable to want to be better businessmen or businesswomen, better athletes, better conquerors. We should want to be better informed, better off financially. We should want, as I've said a few times in this audiobook, to do great things. I know that I do. But no less impressive an accomplishment, being better people, being happier people, being balanced people, being content people, being humble and selfless people, or better yet, all of these traits together. And what is most obvious but most ignored is that perfecting the personal regularly leads to success as a professional, but rarely the other way around. Working to refine our habitual thoughts, working to clamp down on destructive impulses, these are not simply the moral requirements of any decent person. They will make us more successful. They will help us navigate the treacherous waters that ambition will require us to travel. And they are also their own reward. So here you are at the end of this book about ego, having seen as much as one can be shown about the problems of ego from other people's experiences and my own. What is left? Your choices. What will you do with this information? Not just now, but going forward. Every day for the rest of your life, you will find yourself at one of three phases: aspiration, success, failure. You will battle the ego in each of them. You will make mistakes in each of them. You must sweep the floor every minute of every day, and then sweep again.